Good afternoon. My name is Philip Munoz, and I direct the Constitutional Studies program. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. I thought it'd be tough to get many people to come after Thanksgiving, but thank you for coming. This is a great turnout for what I'm sure is going to be a very good event. For the undergraduates here, I know you have or just about to register for classes. We have our Con Studies minor classes available. They're online, and we have, I think there are probably some sheets floating around, and there will be floating around. If you want some information about the Constitutional Studies minor, please come talk to me, talk to Jen Smith, the assistant. We'd be happy to tell you about the minor. I also run the Tocqueville program, and we have our Tocqueville Fellows. Many of our fellows are here. Our fellows help plan events, program events, meet with our speakers, and we have a call for application for the fellowship for the spring semester. So if you're interested in that, please come talk to me. I know that folks in the back, you're welcome to come up front and sit here sit up here on the ground. I'm going to introduce my colleague Rick Garnett, who will introduce our speaker. Professor Garnett is the most distinguished church-state scholar here at Notre Dame, holds a chair at the law school, is a good friend, and despite having gone to Duke University, is one of the closest things I've ever had. Rick?
Thanks, I think. So it's a real treat to introduce my friend, Professor John Inazu. He is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion and a Professor of Political Science down at WashU in St. Louis. He did his undergraduate work and earned his law degree at Duke University. And then he clerked for a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit, and then worked as Associate General Counsel for the U.S. Air Force. He then lost his mind and returned to North Carolina at a school called the University of North Carolina, but I'm assured that he did take classes. He earned his PhD in political science there. He was then, much to his relief, allowed to return to Duke for a fellowship visiting professor position, and he joined the WashU faculty in 2011. John is a prolific scholar, an award-winning teacher, a sought-after, thoughtful commentator. His first book is called Liberty's Refuge, and it's really the groundbreaking study of the First Amendment's underexplored freedom of assembly. His latest book, Confident Pluralism, has been widely discussed, reviewed, and argued about. It's a really valuable contribution to the public square. For me, it's a special treat to welcome John back to Notre Dame and to introduce you to him, because we've been friends and colleagues and collaborators for many years now. I admire his scholarship a great deal, but even more important, I see him as a model of charitable and civil public engagement. At a time when so much of our public square has fallen into sarcasm and snark, into virtue signaling and performance art, John takes a different, better path. He's passionate but not partisan. He's committed to justice but never self-righteously judgmental. He's humble and, as we'll hear today, he's inspiringly confident. Please join me in welcoming John Inazu.
Well, thanks for being here. It's a privilege to be with you, and special for me to be back at Notre Dame. When I was working on this book in draft form, Professor Garnett's program was kind enough to host a roundtable, and lots of feedback, including from some of you out there, that made this a much better book. And it's great to be here with Professor Munoz and others hosting me. So thank you for that, and thanks for showing up on a beautiful South Bend day here to listen for a bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit of an overview of the argument in my book, and then, as advertised in the title, try to think through some implications of the argument for the university context. And when we get to that part, we'll want to think both about the university writ large and maybe even this university and what some of the differences and particularities might be of this place. But let me start with a story to frame what I think are the key issues of the book, and it's about a confirmation hearing. There have been several of note lately, but I want to take you back to one from earlier in the year involving a man named Russell Vogt. This is for a position at the Office of Management and Budget, which most people don't often pay attention to. But in this case, Vogt, who was a graduate of the Evangelical College Wheaton, had at one point written about Islam that Muslims, because they don't know Jesus Christ, stand condemned. And those words were found by one of Senator Sanders' staffers. So in the confirmation hearing, Senator Sanders quoted this to nominee Vogt and went after him pretty hard and said, how could you say such a thing about other people in this country? You are not what America is about, and I'm not going to vote for you. And as I watched that hearing and as I reflected on what had happened, I thought, Senator Sanders would have been perfectly entitled and should have, under his duty, asked nominee Vogt, will you treat every person under the equal protection of the laws, and will you respect the citizenship of every person? And nominee Vogt would have had to agree to that or not been fit for the job. But to say that a deeply held belief over something that matters, an exclusive truth claim, is not what this country is about seems precisely wrong to me. So I wrote to Senator Sanders and I sent him a copy of my book and suggested this alternate reading. He has not yet responded, but there's still hope on that. But I do think actually that learning to live together with our deepest differences, the differences that really matter over consequences that matter, is what this country's been about and is what we need to continue to think of as part of this country. And we don't have to go to Senate confirmation hearings to drive this home. Just think of your own personal reaction, positive or negative, to the words and people you associate with words like evangelical Christian or atheist or Muslim or Black Lives Matter or Make America Great Again, and the sense in which we recognize the differences in our categories and our words, which cuts against the narrative in many of our documents. We tell ourselves we're one nation, indivisible, in search of a more perfect union, and yet many of us are more defined in our relationships by difference than by unity, and that creates a practical problem in need of a political solution. So how do we answer that problem? Well, Rousseau gave us one answer. Rousseau said, it's impossible for men to live at peace with those they think are damned. That's a strikingly bleak assertion, and my argument is that Rousseau is wrong, that it's not only possible but necessary for us to figure out how to live in peace with those with whom we disagree over serious matters. And that's the argument for confident pluralism. And in making this argument, I want to take both of those words seriously, confidence and pluralism. Confidence without pluralism, if you're just confident in what you believe, you'll miss the reality of politics and end up suppressing difference, sometimes with violence. And pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people, that we actually do have these deep differences and that we can't just paper over them with feigned agreement and false unity. Confident pluralism says we take the differences seriously and figure out how to relate across those differences. So there are two dimensions to this argument, one legal and one personal or civic, and I'll go over each of those briefly and then think about some applications for the university context. But let me start with the legal or constitutional argument. And here there's a paradox, and the paradox is in order to allow us to function effectively and peacefully across our differences, we actually have to figure out ways to strengthen the protections for those differences. We have to allow people to be authentically different in our shared political space. And my hunch is that a lot of this goes back to something in our First Amendment that Professor Garnett mentioned, the subject of my first book, the right of assembly. The right of assembly, unfortunately, is, even after my book, is not well known. And so there are about 1 in 10 Americans could name it in the First Amendment, which is not a good track record. But I want to suggest that there's something important and distinct about assembly. There are 5 rights in the First Amendment. I won't call on you to name them, but speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly. And assembly is the only one of those 5 that requires more than one person to be exercised. So I can speak on my own, I can start a blog and be the press on my own, I can petition the government, I can in some ways practice religion on my own, but I cannot assemble on my own. It needs at least one other person. And so right from the get-go, we have, from the founding, a sense in the First Amendment that we aren't just concerned with individual rights that foster individual speech and expression, but rights that have something to do with groups and people within groups and how groups form and what groups mean. And that makes sense in some ways that it should be intuitive to us when we think about the groups that matter most to us and how we form solidarity and sense of belonging and our own beliefs and in sometimes sense of identity within our groups. And so there's something important, I think, in the right of assembly, and it's been lost in our recent constitutional law in two important ways. One is the way we actually protect the boundaries of groups, which is today largely seen around a doctrine called expressive association. You won't find a right of association in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court injected it in 1958, and since 1958 has focused in on this concept of expressive association. This is the idea that the groups that we form in private matter constitutionally mostly when they are outwardly expressive, when the groups say something or have some message to people out there, or when they facilitate some other right like religious practice. The problem is, though, that most of us in our everyday and informal interactions actually aren't often concerned about expression. We're thinking about the other things that groups do for us. And there's this doctrinal move of narrowing constitutional protections to expressive associations leads us with some odd results. So one example from the Top Hatters Motorcycle Club, a biker group in California. And a few years ago, some members of the group were headed to the Gilroy Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California. Gilroy happens to be the garlic capital of the world, so it's not surprising they have a garlic festival. And the Top Hatters wanted to check it out, and so they walked through the gates, and they were stopped by the authorities who said that they were wearing gang colors and would not be invited into the festival. They had their logo was a skull and bones with a top hat, right? The biker gang logo. So they sued after being denied entry to the festival, and two federal courts rejected their claims. But what was most interesting for our purposes about the lawsuit was that the court said the Top Hatters are not an expressive association and therefore have no legal protection against what the government did to them. And that should be odd for a number of reasons, one of which is that they were denied entry to the festival precisely for their expression, and yet they were held to be non-expressive. But also that this group of bikers, say what you want about, or like what you do or don't about biker groups, they do more things than express. They have solidarity with each other. If you go to their website, tophattersmc.com, you'll find a picture page with lots of events they do and a jukebox where you can play their 70s classic rock, and a tribute page to a member who's died, and a mission statement. And these are all massively expressive, and yet courts have found they are not an expressive association. And we can think of other examples from cases, including, of all things, a nudist colony, which was found to be not expressive. Don't think about that too much. But that there are gaps in the law and the protections we have for groups, and part of this is around this doctrine of expressive association. That's one half of the missing constitutional piece. The other part is what is called the public forum. And this is the space where we ask government to both pay for and manage spaces for us to come together with our separate groups and commingle in various ways. And maybe we just go there to protest side by side against each other, or maybe we go there to try to inform each other or to inform government of our views. But these spaces have existed and have been an important part of our constitutional experiment. Typically, when you think of a sidewalk or a city park, you think of a space where government has to allow protests and viewpoints in groups of all kinds. And there are some restrictions. These restrictions are gradually encroaching upon expressive liberties, so that today, a doctrine that originally should have allowed kind of an all-comers approach, any view gets to come in, is now restricting the kinds of protests based on ideological grounds. So depending on where you are in the country, your protest for Black Lives Matter might be restricted, or your ability as a church to rent public space, or your anti-abortion protest, or your label protest. So whatever your beliefs out there, there's a dog in this fight for you, and the public forum today does not live up to its stated constitutional expectations. And that's a problem because we need not only to protect the different groups that we form, but we need to allow spaces for those groups to come into play in the public square. There are some other complications about this. I won't go into them, but think about how many of these formerly public spaces today are now privatized in some sense. So the municipalities that are actually owned by some corporate holding company, and the public space is not actually government land, but is a space that could be subject to different kinds of restrictions. Or Facebook or Twitter, which are where a lot of our social activity now happens, private companies that can regulate outside of the First Amendment. So big concerns current and looming about the scope of the public forum. But I want to suggest that both of these legal doctrines, our associational protections and the protections for the public forum, need to be rehabilitated in order for us to think about how effectively to live across our differences. That's one part of the challenge, and that's largely on lawmakers and judges and others, but the rest of it's on us. So the civic side of this, how do we, in our individual relationships and capacities, figure out how to navigate this difference? And it turns out there's a lot of our lives that the law does not touch. So think about free speech, for example. You can mostly say anything you want to anybody, right? There are a couple of exceptions to that rule. And what are some of the exceptions? What's a big free speech exception?
Fighting words.
Fighting words. What else? Yelling, fire in the crowded theater if the theater's not on fire. Criminal conspiracy and perjury and insider trading. So there are a couple speech things you can't do. But for the most part, you can say whatever you want to anyone, including hate speech and emotionally damaging speech and psychologically harmful speech. And the Constitution and our laws protect your right to do that. But I think what that does, if we're serious about trying to live together with our differences, is it puts a lot more responsibility on us to choose how we operate within this freedom and to choose how we use our words with each other. And I have three guiding aspirations that I suggest for framing our speech practices and also our relational practices with one another. I talk about tolerance, humility, and patience, and I'm just going to briefly go through each of those. And I mean to define them in a very particular way. So let's start with tolerance. By tolerance, I mean generally the idea that for the most part, we have to accept the beliefs and practices of other people, even those with whom we disagree and even those that we find morally problematic. Now, there are going to be some limits. There's no society that will be truly pluralistic. We will not have the South Bend chapter of Al-Qaeda or the local cannibal group, right? We're going to set limits. But within those broad limits, we need to be maximally tolerant, which does not mean that we accept all differences as the same. So one of my growing concerns in the higher ed space is that tolerance is increasingly seen as acceptance. You are not tolerating me unless you fully accept and embrace who I am, what I believe, what I see myself as. I think that's ultimately just philosophically impossible for any of us to do, so it's a word game that doesn't work, but it's a powerful word game, and I think we need to distinguish tolerance as a kind of endurance, enduring the other for the sake of coexistence and relationship, rather than tolerance as full acceptance. That's tolerance. Humility goes even a step further, and it says that while we recognize others will sometimes find our views wrong or evil or problematic, we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. So with humility, we're asked to look at some of our most basic, deepest beliefs and realize that the premises from which those beliefs flow are not going to be provable in the logical sense. We're not going to be able to sit down and have a 30-minute conversation and convince someone else with a mathematical proof why God exists or why abortion is wrong or why gay marriage is right or whatever the views are that you have because of these deeply held premises. So humility suggests that we have a different posture that allows for the recognition of limits to what we can prove in discourse to one another. And then finally, patience, the idea that we can listen to seek to understand and empathize with others. And this doesn't mean, again, that we're ultimately going to agree with them. So in fact, it might mean that my patient listening to your views will further convince me why you are crazy or misinformed. But we can at least, in the conversation, start with the posture that's going to aim for the most charitable understanding and seek to listen and seek to understand. So that's the civic side of things. And whatever happens with the law, the civic side is on us. I do think that when we seek and practice these aspirations in our individual lives, that we can start to close a kind of relational distance with other people. That doesn't mean we're going to bridge ideological difference all the time. We might actually still end up being very different in our beliefs, but we can bridge this relational difference, and that's no small thing. We can find, in other words, common ground even when we disagree on the common good on some matters, and that's important to do. But it'll take a lot of work. And this brings me to the university. So why particularly the university? And part of my thinking here, really, since I've written the book and spoken on more university campuses, is the sense that if we can't figure out how to do it here in a place like this, then where else in society are we going to be able to have these hard efforts of relationship across difference and confident pluralism? And these spaces where at a place like Notre Dame, there's a heavy residential component, and right, those of you who are undergrads are here for usually 4 years, right, in relationship with one another. And at least at the schools I know, WashU and Duke, we've got all kinds of creative ways to bring people together with smoothie bars in the gym and other things like that, but that are actually intentionally designed to foster opportunities for sitting down and sharing ideas, and in the best sense that our classrooms and our teachers would do that too, and that the late night dorm conversations would echo those efforts. But that's going to take, I think, a recognition on the part of the university writ large, higher education, of what its purpose is. And right now, the question of purpose in higher ed is under tremendous strain. So I know that there is a certain number 5 ranked basketball team in the country right now, which is not quite the number 1 team, but close. That aside, college athletics puts tremendous strain on the purpose and coherence of higher ed. I love college basketball. I will stay up late to watch games, perhaps even last night, but it puts tremendous strain on the purpose of what a place like this is. And massive grants and research dollars from the federal government put strain on the purpose and coherence of a place. And outside money from foundations and private wealth from across the ideological spectrum, and pressure on the humanities from a job sector that is saying, I don't know, learn statistics and business, and forget about Tocqueville, which is actually what you shouldn't be doing if you want to be engaged as a citizen in this world. But these pressures are not going away, and in some ways they're only going to get harder. And they will force, I think, universities to ask harder questions about what their purpose is. Notre Dame, I think, is an interesting example here, because here you have an effort to name a purpose, and that makes this place different than a lot of schools around the country. I think it's harder to answer the purpose question at a place like WashU. What's the purpose of WashU other than be better than Georgetown and recruit from UCLA, which is no small thing, but doesn't give you much of a purpose. So I think actually we have some guidance here from some Catholic thinkers. Alistair McIntyre said the university should be a place of constrained disagreement, where we take our most deeply held ideas and beliefs and test them against the best possible arguments from the other side, both in order to understand the other side and the challenges, but also to understand our own beliefs better. Or John Courtney Murray, who called the university as a place where creeds war intelligibly. And I think both of those ideas capture a tension important to the nature of the university. Think about constrained disagreement. It requires constraint. You can't just let anyone in here. It matters that teachers know what they're talking about and they know how to teach. It matters who your outside speakers are, that they're not just entertainment and bomb throwers, but they're actually engaged in the shared discourse. So there are constraints, or there at least should be constraints in what happens. But then there's also disagreement, and real disagreement that pushes to the heart and the core of the things that divide us, and the opportunity to make you and me uncomfortable and to press us to those limit principles and those hard cases that we often don't like to think about from our side of an argument, but that's essential to learn how to do. And not just learn how to argue, but learn how to listen and learn how to engage across these differences. And I think for those universities that can either recover or start to name the purpose question around this idea of constrained disagreement, around this idea of creeds warring intelligibly, there is the possibility of practicing and modeling this kind of confident pluralism, not just for you all here now, but for you all who will be citizens of a much larger political project where the stakes are much higher and the margins of time are often much smaller. And so this is the time to start. 3 quick challenges, I think, related to the higher ed space. And these are challenges that cash out differently in a public university subject formally to the First Amendment and a private university like Notre Dame that can mostly do what it wants. But I want to just sort of walk through a couple of them. The first one is the idea of academic freedom. What are the limits that we put on faculty especially, but maybe also students and administrators, or the lack of limits to pursue inquiry? So this fuzzy notion of academic freedom, to whom does it apply? What speech does it cover? What inquiry does it cover? Does it cover students? It turns out when I started researching this, I found, much to my shock, that many courts think academic freedom lies with the administration, not the faculty member, which was a huge blow to my own sense of the world, where I thought my academic freedom meant I decided what to do. But there are, in fact, some schools, some state schools now that say faculty and what they teach, and in some ways what they even research, is limited by the nature of their being a public employee, and that academic freedom does not go that far. On the other hand, we can intuit that there has to be something to the idea of a limit on academic freedom. If I'm a physics professor, I can't walk into the classroom and start spouting poetry every day, unless it's some kind of really good lesson in physics. And I also can't talk about, the world out there being driven by invisible goblins who, instead of math or these sorts of things. And so there are limits to what the classroom can do and limits to academic freedom. I think they're tied to norms, maybe more than laws. And we might think, what would it be like to take seriously the question of malpractice by teachers? I don't think we ask that question enough. I'm not suggesting that you do it here, but what would that look like? What kinds of responsibilities do teachers have to push you in the broadest sense, but not to be talking about poetry in the physics class? So that's academic freedom. The next point is this idea of what it means to be either an employee or a citizen or a participant in the university. And this is hard, especially in the public context. So formally, for public universities and public employees, that include teachers, that include administrators, that include many students actually. So students on scholarship, athletes can be public employees. Students in pre-professional programs can be public employees. Some, maybe even students on merit scholarships can be public employees. So what does it mean for the university to say, you work for us, so you can't actually say what you want at the bar or on your Facebook page or in the dorm room or out in the community? And what are the constraints? What are both the constraints and the responsibilities for public employees? Here you have a slightly different challenge because you're not a public institution. But to the extent that you're here as part of the Notre Dame community, what are the norms that Notre Dame asks of you in your speech and your discourse with one another? And how do you balance those with the ideas of academic freedom? And then related to that, the third point, the importance of religious pluralism. And here again, you're a special test case as a Catholic university with a Catholic identity. But what does it mean to take seriously the importance of not just diversity and all of the other forms that are very well known in higher ed, but also the importance of religious diversity, where we are going to come together, even at a place like this, with students who have different religious beliefs and perspectives on deeply held matters. In the public context or in the private context at a place like WashU, we do a very good job about naming and helping people navigate different forms of diversity, but almost no attention to the significance of religious diversity or what it means to be a religiously diverse institution, which certainly operates in a religiously diverse world. When 40% of the content of the New York Times is about religious matters or religious conflicts, we can't be producing college graduates who know nothing about religious difference or the importance of religious pluralism. So these are, I think, essential challenges and issues to navigate in the university context, both writ large and then specifically at a place like Notre Dame. And the stakes are high, right? And they're getting more urgent when we look out there, when we look on social media at the fracture and the discord that is actually, I think, every day challenging more and more of the kinds of arguments that I'm trying to advocate here. We've got challenges in our echo chambers and our news sources. Not so much that there's partisan news, because we've always had partisan news, but the volume and frequency and intensity of it, so that when I was growing up, I got the news maybe twice a day, and now I'm getting it every 3 minutes, and it's reinforcing my views over and over again, and the stakes are raised, and we're all in this sort of constant state of frenzy. and we're living in geographically separated places, and we aren't actually practicing very well these ideas of tolerance, humility, and patience, and we have national leaders who are not exuding these qualities either. So we have challenges ahead of us, which then raises maybe the natural question is whether there's any room for hope in what I'm talking about. There was a reviewer early on of my book who, although he was otherwise fairly kind, suggested the book would be doomed to immediate irrelevance because in his view he thought there was no audience that would be willing to engage with it. And I think and hope that he's wrong, not just because I'd like people to read the book, but also because I do think that against great odds, part of the American experiment has been finding, however modest, a kind of unity across our differences. And this is not the first time we've had massive challenges to our unity and sense of agreement. There are actually some new factors and some uncharted waters. We're figuring out the social media piece. We're figuring out what it means to have a demographic of the country that now rejects kind of all forms of transcendence or faith altogether, so that where 30 years ago the questions about pluralism were religious pluralism, can Catholics and Muslims and Jews get along, now we have a much harder challenge about pluralism, including belief and non-belief, and what is it within that pluralism challenge that can hold and bind us together, however small. I'd like to suggest, and I will keep arguing to the extent that I can, that we do have within our historical, constitutional, and civic resources the possibilities to navigate some of these differences. And I think the goal can be modest here, that this does not ultimately give us the American dream, but that it might help avoid the American nightmare. And right now, that's no small thing. So let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions and engagement to follow.
We always invite our undergraduate students to ask the first set of questions. So any undergraduates with intolerant, prideful, or impatient questions, you're welcome. And when you do ask questions, stand up and tell us who you are. Way in the back.
My name is Brian Kurtz. I'm a junior, political science major and constitutional studies minor. I was wondering what your thoughts are on religious academic institutions teaching policy initiatives and policy actions that go against Catholic or religious beliefs. Should there be a tolerance there or a total acceptance?
Right, so and I'll try to repeat the questions for the recording. So this one is, I'm assuming not a hypothetical, at a place like Notre Dame with a Catholic identity, a Catholic institution, to what extent should it either teach or tolerate differing religious views? And here I think we have to make some distinctions about the complex nature of the university. So because this is a place that with an institutional identity, with a board governance around that identity, there are going to be positions that the university takes that it would seem would want to comport with the Catholic mission and identity of the place. And then every institution makes layered decisions about who has to be on board with that mission. Is it the board of trustees only? Does it also include faculty and senior administrators? Does it include all of the people who work here? Does it include all students? And whatever level you decide, then I would just say be consistent with it, and within that decision, force or fight for as much possible pushing of boundaries as you can, so that in the classroom, for sure, you want to, as McIntyre said, test and retest these central theses by subjecting them to the most powerful arguments out there, right? And don't just read kind of pro-Notre Dame literature out there, but read the critics and what they're saying. But I think to make an institutional coherent and following into a tradition over time, you have to both set and reinforce boundaries. And the institutions that fail to do that at the top level quickly lose their identity and uniqueness.
Another question from an undergrad? Okay, let's open it up to,
Hi, Ileana. I'm also a junior in political science and peace studies. So I have a question. You were talking about tolerance and this idea of tolerance but not acceptance, and then also recognizing other people's and other things. Could you succinctly say where you would draw that line? So you mentioned, the example of cannibalism, as kind of something that we shouldn't tolerate, where would you draw the line or bounds within different societies? Does it change like per each group or per what it is that they're kind of attempting to put out into society?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I never do anything succinctly, so I can't promise that. But I do. So the question is, where do you draw the line between tolerance and the inability to accept? Or maybe another way to think about it is, if I'm suggesting you have to separate people from their ideas and practices and respect people while not necessarily respecting practices, at what point does that line collapse? And so the first observation is it will inevitably reach a limit principle anywhere. That's the cannibalism point, right? So we are going to draw lines at some point. So then the next question is, where does that line drawing occur? And I think actually this question has become much harder in the last few months. My friend Ibu Patel, who talks about similar issues, used to say in these kinds of discussions, let's start by stipulating we're not talking about the Nazis. Well, it's harder to do that today, right? Because we actually are talking about the Nazis. And so maybe we start by saying there are going to be some very hard limit principles where we say, I don't know if I can sit down and separate a respect for you that can distinguish between the ideas. Now, for people of faith, you can start by, this person is created in the image of God, and I am called to respect this created image bearer no matter what, which is going to be sometimes a hard challenge. But in the political and civic space, I wonder, I'm close to a First Amendment absolutist, and I think it's important to protect a lot of speech. But I've had the thought experiment lately. What if we just said, into that narrow category of Al-Qaeda and the cannibals, if we just threw in the Nazis and the Klan too, and said you just don't get to exist? You're still going to have a lot of hate groups out there, so you're not going to solve that problem. But you do have a symbolic difference in these two groups, particularly in the history of our country. And I don't know. I mean, the response is always, well, there's a slippery slope, right? And once you start throwing some groups in there, where do you draw the line? And maybe the answer to that is draw the line at 2. Put those 2 groups in there, and let's move on. And that doesn't solve all the problems, but that's the best I can do right now, thinking about that really important question of where the line runs out.
I was wondering, first of all, thank you. On universities because you talked about this idea of needing to have disagreements, but on universities where there's like a significant majority of students or faculty maybe that hold one set of beliefs, do you have to hold up purposely and create other arguments? Or is it the goal of the university just to try to have those conversations naturally? Or do you have to try to actively pursue a diverse set of viewpoints, which then you can engage with?
Yeah, so this question is, given that many university faculties lack a kind of intellectual or ideological diversity, how does that affect the goal of trying to pursue this McIntyrean vision of constrained disagreement across as broad a set of issues as possible? I think this is a really important and hard structural challenge that needs to be addressed in ways it has not yet been addressed. There was just today, I think, in the Washington Post, a piece by 2 Harvard professors pointing out this problem and some of the tremendous ongoing challenges that it creates, not just internal to the university community, but in the political process, where you have a set of relatively much more conservative legislators, both at many state levels and also at the federal level, who are now in funding wars with universities, whether it's through the tax code at the federal level or state funding. And this is not, the growing animosity here is creating or perpetuating a huge political problem. I think the very best teachers and students can push themselves toward the other side of the argument. This is one of the things I love about law school and teaching law students, is you have to, to be any good as a lawyer, you've got to understand the other side, and you've got to understand the best possible argument and how to defeat it, which is going to make your argument better, right? And you sometimes might still lose in court because the process isn't perfect, but the better lawyers are going to know how to do that. And there's a way in which the classroom can also engage in that kind of dialogue. But it's not going to be easy, and I think when you have a more homogeneous faculty on any level, it's going to be harder for that faculty to go outside of its priors and its premises to think about those sorts of things. And I think I've been on several panels lately at my own school where I'm very much worried about the sense of whether we're having a debate or a pep rally over a certain issue. And I don't think pep rallies belong in academic panels. So this is it's a huge concern that's not easily solvable, but we need to be addressing it. Thanks.
I'm Cole Millett, junior, poli-sci major, and so Notre Dame has been in the news recently about their position on contraception, and their result has kind of seemed contrary to the Catholic faith, and so I was wondering, do you think that there's certain ideological sacrifices that a university has to make to remain a university in today's day and age?
Yeah, so the question is about Notre Dame's position as highlighted in the national media and other places around contraception coverage under the health care plan and the Affordable Care Act, and whether it's possible for a Catholic university to remain entirely consistent with Catholic doctrine, or whether there have to be some trade-offs there. I don't know the particular issue well enough to comment intelligibly on it, although I will say as an outsider it looks strange. It looks inconsistent across the course of the legislation in terms of the position this school has taken. But I haven't studied it carefully enough to sort of render an expert thought about that. So on the broader question, though, of whether a university can remain full to its mission, I want to think it can, but I think there has to be a mutual understanding between the people in the university and the people in the broader religious community. And I think about this same tension all the time in my own life. Not that WashU is religious, because it's not, but for people of faith in the academy, what does it mean to be doing something a little different than the pastor in the local church, right, or the local civic group, but trying to be engaged in this world of ideas that is constantly meant to challenge your fundamental assumptions in some ways, and is meant to push you to the limits in ways that you don't necessarily want the 5th grade Sunday school teacher to be doing, right? So there's an institutional particularity to, especially to religious institutions of higher ed, that can allow for some differentiation, and in the best sense, in the best case, that can be in relationship to the broader religious community. But I think too often what happens in practice is there becomes, over time, a mutual distrust, and that sense of actually the body doing many different things breaks down, and instead it's two bodies fighting with each other, to kill the metaphor.
Okay, let's open it up to
So you didn't say anything explicitly about what appears to be sort of the assault on free expression at some universities, or at least an effort or willingness, eagerness of some institutions to suppress speech that hurts feelings. So that it seems like this is a trend. Maybe I'm wrong. And there's a Brookings study out recently, a survey of college students. 44% of college students said that the First Amendment does not protect hate speech. 39% said it did, and 16% didn't know. So I wonder to what extent you predictively think that there has to be a kind of, this is a danger to the kind of discourse and debate that you are encouraging.
Yeah, so let me say two different things about the observation. The question is, given attention on college campuses to wanting in some ways to censor speech or expression that might be hurtful to certain people, and so we can think about trigger warnings and microaggressions and safe spaces and these kinds of ideas. And then the related observation that the Pew poll and other recent studies show that really millennials are increasingly suggesting you should not have the First Amendment protect hate speech, or in some cases hate speech with which we disagree. So two things about that. First, the polling, I think, suggests a real problem, right? I mean, we can't, and what it suggests is, or reminds us, is we can't just take for granted that First Amendment norms are just out there in perpetuity and we're always going to have them. And that the law and culture actually work together, and that we shouldn't expect that a 20-year-old today knows the history of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the cases in the 1920s that led us to the place, the compromise and the bargain that we've made in the First Amendment that says we do actually protect a lot of very harmful and damaging speech. We recognize that that's a real cost to real people, but it's the bargain we've struck with very good reason and through painful lessons over history. And so unless we're actually telling and retelling that story, and this is a 5th grade challenge as much as a college challenge, those numbers are going to increase, and that's going to be a very bad thing, I think, for what I'm talking about, but also for society more generally. Now, on the specific questions in terms of the policies and the practices that manifest on college campuses, I'm a little torn on some of this stuff. So I think I mean, when I have a university administrator tell me, here is language you should put on your syllabus about trigger warnings, my first response is absolutely not. It's my syllabus, and I'm not going to put anyone's words on it. But then my second thought is, as a good teacher, I'm going effectively to do this kind of work in a lot of ways. I'm not going to call it a trigger warning, but before I teach 3 classes on rape in my first year criminal law class, we're going to have a discussion about different framings and understandings, and we're going to name the fact that many people in my classroom are going to have personal experience with this really hard issue. Or when we talk about minority relationships with law enforcement communities, 7 miles from Ferguson, Missouri, we're going to talk about why students in my classroom have come from parts of the country where they've never thought about this question, and there are other students who've been profiled and arrested, several times a year for the color of their skin. And if you can't set that up effectively, I think it's just bad teaching. I'm not sure we need the microaggression warning there. And then I'll say one more thing about safe spaces. I have kind of a middle position here, which nobody likes, so maybe that's really good, or maybe I'm just really wrong. But I think on the complex setting of the university, we actually do need to recognize something like a safe space, which is actually very akin to a right of association or a right to be your own group in some spaces. So those of you who live in the dorms, right, just as I don't want even a good friend like Rick, I don't want him in my living room every day. I want time to say, sometimes you need to leave. I certainly don't want the heckler there every day. So are there spaces in your shared living arrangements here where you have to say, I just need to be, safe in some ways, or by myself? Or if you're a member of a particular community, we just need our people together for a while. On the other hand, that can't coherently apply across the university. So to call the classroom a safe space, I don't even understand what that means, given the premise of the McIntyrean assumption that I started with. So I guess a middle ground there, a concern about the polling data and the speech issue, and then maybe a commendation to good teaching without the coercive norms from above for it.
Thanks, Daniel.
Hi, Hi, I'm Daniel Mark, visiting here this year in Phillips Tocqueville program. Mainly just want to say that Britt Garnett's welcome in my living room every day.
You're a patient man.
Yeah.
He's good.
So I'm visiting here from Villanova University, which also occasionally has some success in basketball against UNC. And so I love the university life, and obviously it is, it's what I do. But I want to at least play devil's advocate and say that maybe you're looking at the university the wrong way. You framed it as, if we can't do it here, we can't do it anywhere. But maybe part of the mistake is thinking actually that the university is the best place for this, where in many ways, again, to play devil's advocate, that university is the worst place, or the least likely place for this to fall. Because where is the most likely place for all this to happen, notwithstanding some of the geographic separation we have increasingly, I guess, in our country? It's actually in real life that it's the market in the broadest and most organic sense is where there is diversity, because diversity and confident pluralism, because people interact with each other in natural and organic ways. I mean, I would even say, I'll put the point another way in a moment, but I would even say, I suspect that attending a local parish in South Bend will expose one to a far more diverse view of people. This is my experience in synagogue in South Bend, socioeconomically, educationally, than attending Mass on campus here at Notre Dame. And I think I agree with you completely that universities, first of all, have their idea wrong when instead of fostering confident pluralism, they're protecting people from contrary ideas. I completely agree with you on that point. But even in the second case, and in the school that I attended for my own education, we used to joke often about how the most colossal failures and biggest wastes of money, where the university, to use our phrase, intentionally designed things to create social, the social engineering of confident pluralism, I think is probably right. So the more so, as someone who favors markets more than not, the more social engineered the confident pluralism is, actually the less successful it is. And the university has a great role in all of its educational aspects in the classroom to train people in the humanities in ways that open their minds and so on. But the actual let's foster interactions that are going to rival what happens in coffee hour after mass or at the laundromat or all the parents sitting together at Little League. It can't compare, can't keep up. And insofar as it sees that as its mission and pours all this time and money into it, it's actually at least wasting and possibly even somehow driving things in the opposite direction.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so the question, to summarize really quickly, is am I dead wrong about the university being one of the best sites for confident pluralism? Maybe, and bye. No, just kidding. I think, I think there's a lot of truth to what you said. So maybe how I would want to state more clearly what I was trying to get at is that the university is one of the best training grounds we have for this. That's going to require trust, especially between faculty and students. Right? Are students going to trust faculty to say, you're pushing me on these questions because you want me to get better at doing this, right? And that there's the time and the space and the relationship in the ideal sense of faculty doing this with students. It requires good faculty and students entering into the effort in good faith and not just blowing it off. There are limitations though, and you named some of them, right? So there are age demographic limitations that might not be as bounded in the local parish or the local synagogue. And I think that, to me, one of the biggest tensions right now is between age demographics. I'm always in these places where people are saying boomers don't understand millennials and millennials don't understand boomers. And so that's an important part of the political puzzle as well. And then actually implicit in what I was saying is there are tremendous class problems in especially more elite universities, which are not helping us solve some of the tremendous class problems out there. That's also, I think, a problem in most cities. Right? So it seems to me like really kind of sophisticated urban areas are really good about pluralism and diversity across many metrics. Right? You think about racial blends of coworkers and families, but the class segregation actually is reinforced in cities in a lot of ways, and that's a particular problem. Was it something I said? And but so I guess so to maybe circle back to the question, the premise of the question, is the university maybe not one of the best places? There are arguments. This certainly has to happen in places beyond universities. I think that universities might be a necessary but not sufficient component of what we need to see happen. I think religious communities need to do this far better than they're often doing. I mean, maybe Catholics and Jews are better at the class and vocational and racial integration, but Protestants are not very good at that for the most part, right? And Protestants are a lot of people in the country.
I think the lights or the university telling me I need to get a Catholic involved in this conversation. Ms. Campbell?
I want to follow up with what David's point about pluralism, the confident pluralism. The book.
Father, a little louder. Sorry.
I'm having a senior moment on the title, but John Shields wrote this book about conservatives in the academy. Anyone remember it? Sort of passing on the right or something like that. And he says that the academy has been going very much in a particular direction, such that a conservative, particularly in the humanities and social sciences these days, pretty much sort of tries to pass. You cannot reveal who you really are for fear of promotion or et cetera, et cetera. So I guess the question is the university a place where there is enough diversity of views, or is everyone having to sing from the same song sheet to make sure they'll be promoted, to get their grant, et cetera, to allow for the kind of confident pluralism, which seems quite attractive to me and what one would hope the university could be, but is the trajectory of thinking so much in a very sort of progressive direction that anyone who might have a contrary point of view shuts up?
Right, and so this is somewhat related to your question too, and the question is, what about the lack of maybe ideological but also religious diversity in higher ed? And I would say, especially elite higher ed, this is a problem that increases with elite higher ed, and I think it is a sociologically significant problem. I think I worry sometimes that the conversation is overstated in both directions, both by liberal academic types who say it's not a problem, and by conservatives outside of the university that over-describe the problem. So I think actually, I mean, at my place, WashU, it is a problem, but it's not a problem that has created a watershed yet. I mean, there's still room to operate and be a person of faith, and to raise, I think, in most cases, serious arguments about serious matters. Now, that's a dynamic situation, right? And it does seem to be changing quickly on some issues, and there are some issues that I don't think that are easily mentioned in university settings, and that is a result of a sort of groupthink or echo chamber, and it's one that is replicated by faculty hires and graduate programming and stuff. I will say, though, I think that part of the blame here lies in, and I'll pick on my own people, and because I think the Catholics have done relatively good, but I think the Protestants and evangelicals 40 years ago gave up on higher ed, right, and said it's lost, we're pulling out our money, we're stopping pipelines, we're going to get out of mentoring, which was exactly the wrong strategy. So in some ways, I think there's a sense in which people are reaping what they've sown, and now would be a good time to try to restore some of those efforts, right? It's not that there's not money out there, or it's not that there aren't talented undergraduates who can go be faculty and be both faithful and really good scholars and teachers, but there are cultural incentives from some parts of society that say that's the lost university, don't go near it. And the more that narrative is reinforced, I think the harder it's going to get.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the question to tie your lecture to what we're talking about in my class right now. So if I understand you right, for a culture to become better, we need to make individuals more tolerant, more humble, and more patient. Right? The three things my wife most wants in me.
They didn't come from nowhere.
Does expanding non-discrimination law and norms to operate in the civil society, private businesses, and this is a connection with class, does expanding non-discrimination law or limiting non-discrimination law make us more humble, patient, and tolerant?
Yeah,
So how do we implement this?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I take the question more on the legal than the personal side. So I don't actually think that these aspirations, they're tied somewhat to the legal structures, but it's hard to think about a policy itself. I mean, it can further those aspirations, but it might not itself embody those. But I think it's a really important question. At some point, any kind of non-discrimination norm is going to butt up against the strong associational protections that I'm talking about, right? As the Supreme Court has said many times, the right to include includes the right not to include, or the right to exclude, right? You can't be a group unless you name people who can't be part of the group. That's true of my own family, that's true of a sports team, or a singing group, or a university, or a religious group. And so to the extent that you believe my premise that we're not going to figure out how to do this confident pluralism thing without stronger and more authentic recognitions of our differences and our group differences, then it is going to be essential to limit some of the encroachment of non-discrimination norms. Now, the qualifier I would have there is, at some point, the political and power monopolies that can arise from discriminatory action actually start to impede the ability of other citizens to be citizens, right? And even to pursue their own different ways of life. And we saw this most clearly in the civil rights era with Jim Crow as an example of where this happens. And so I think we ought to be attentive to monopoly power circumstances, right? And what's hard about this is actually in this country today, there are very regional differences, right? So in some places in this country, if you're the Christian group, you are the dominant group, right? And your norms, whether they're legally reinforced or not, your norms are controlling the discourse. And people who aren't part of your group are out and excluded and denied opportunities. And there are other meaningful infringements on what they do. In other parts of the country, it's exactly reversed, right? If you're the Christian group, you are the most marginalized part. And so we're having discussions, and this plays into non-discrimination debates. We're having discussions at a national level that are reflecting down to very different local circumstances. And that's a growing challenge, not just in this area, but in a lot of different areas, like police violence, pick an issue and we have regional differences over what people are actually experiencing.
So I'm a postdoc here, and my colleague, a postdoc in the political science department here from Duke.
Welcome.
I want to ask about the psychology of a good, confident pluralist, because as you mentioned, one of the virtues that you want to inculcate is humility, where you described that humility as an awareness that you can't prove the premises of your deeply held beliefs. And it seems to me that if someone really believes that, like not pretends to believe it for the purposes of politeness and getting along, but really believes that to be the case, it's pretty hard to be confident in those beliefs. In other words, how is it possible to, I mean, there's an element of faith that I understand, but we're talking about a whole bunch of other things besides faith, presumably, when we talk about people's deeply held beliefs in the public square. How does one maintain a genuine humility about the grounds of their beliefs while also being confident in the rightness of those?
Yeah, great. So the relationship between confidence and humility, particularly with respect to beliefs that are deeply held, but so if we acknowledge that we cannot prove those to other people, doesn't that impugn our confidence in those very beliefs? I think here there's a way in which, and you named faith as part of this, I think faith might be central to the entire question, which is to say that whether you're religious or not, you act in this world on faith, and it's faith in all kinds of things, right? In all kinds of unprovable things and first premises, whether they're tied to transcendent belief or not. My friend Kevin Rowe has a wonderful book called One True Life. He's a theologian at Duke, and he makes the argument very compellingly why this is the case, that you live into a set of beliefs, you act on those beliefs in the world, those beliefs require faith, and you do those, and all of us do that every day with a degree of confidence. And I think that to tie faith and confidence together, we can do that without worrying about almost like a modernist approach to proof. And there are some great resources out there about this. The theologian Leslie Newbigin, I think, is an important voice on some of this. And I think there are actually McIntyrean reasons for a similar kind of move. So the idea that you can actually, some things are better shown than stated, for example, right? And you can actually prove non-discursively what you believe by the way that you live your life, right? And at the end of the day, I think that's probably what many of us do on important matters. So that's not entirely satisfactory, but I think it suggests at least that the cognitive recognition that humility means we are limited in what we can prove epistemically to one another does not impugn our confidence in ultimate things.
I think we have time for about two more. Let's see, in the back.
I was just going to say I appreciate you being here, but I'm wondering if sometimes we underestimate the relationship, the complementary relationship of faith and reason. And there are certain issues that, like you happen to mention the issue of abortion, and you said that that's an issue it's very hard to prove. But perhaps that's because we're asking the wrong questions. And I don't know who, but some famous person said that the beginning of wisdom is knowing which questions to ask. So in regards to abortion, for instance, we all know it's not possible for a human person to conceive anything other than another human person. We know that every son or daughter of a human person can only be a human person. So really the question is, the issue is not, is a son or daughter existing in a human person? We have to be honest and say that the issue is whether or not we have a right to destroy that life. And by not pointing the truth or the reason behind why the Catholic Church teaches what it teaches, it becomes simply an issue of it's your opinion against my opinion. But in essence, you have been you since the moment of your conception. I have been me, I don't know if that's correct grammar, since the beginning of mine. And that's the same for every person in this room. So I'm wondering if perhaps part of the problem with pluralism and part of the reason why we can't become united is because we've lost our sense of reason.
So the question is the connection between faith and reason with the particular example of abortion, and isn't a better or a different way to think about this, returning to more reasoned arguments. And so your question reminded me that I forgot I was at Notre Dame, and so I should confess that I actually am not a natural law person, and there are ways and arguments, people who make these arguments that there are natural law ways to reason to these kinds of ideas, irrespective of belief or where you are in the world. I actually think the best response I've seen to that kind of a premise is by a theologian, Paul Griffiths, who has an article called The Nature of Desire, where his premise is at some point you can live into your own practices to such a degree that you can no longer reason in an unadulterated, pure way. And so that even if you start with the premise that everybody should have access to the same reason, you can start to live a life in such a way that you can no longer access that reason. I'm persuaded by that to a large degree, and so I'm not as confident that pure reason, in the sense that I heard you describe it, will be the right approach. At the same time, I do think a combination of persuasion and reason and lived experience and arguments can change people's minds both individually and collectively. And we've seen this in all kinds of social movements, some of which we think are good and some of which we think are bad. And so I think that there's every reason to continue to pursue a basket of approaches to these tough issues, right? And not to give up on fighting for them in the public square. But I'm not sure that reason alone will get us there.
Christian, last question.
Christian, junior political science major. I was wondering, you mentioned that the freedom of speech incurs a responsibility on us, namely tolerance, humility, and patience. And the goal of that is to create a common ground and bridge this relational gap, not necessarily an ideological gap. But I'm curious, how would you respond to the criticism that agreeing to disagree isn't enough? People like Mark Lilla that would argue that we need a robust conception of the common good vested in something like citizenship. That agreeing to disagree doesn't go far enough. That we need something more. How would you respond?
Yeah. So the question is common ground enough, or do we really need a common good? It's a great question to end on. I think I'm not sure when we think about the big questions that people have in this country. What's the purpose of the country? What's the nature of a human being? What does it mean to have a flourishing life? I don't know what the common good out of those big questions is. I think from a Christian tradition that has a long history about naming the common good, not just for people who believe, but for the entire created order, you can't give up on that language, and you talk about the common good. But in the political space, to believe that we're going to be able to name with specificity what that common good is for people from very different starting points, I think is less likely. But I do think, so maybe the practical place to start is from the ground up with local examples, and with finding and establishing and living into common ground, you can start to recover a sense of what a common good might look like. But this is going to be a long project, right? This is in it for the long haul, not for the short term. And so just one quick example to close it out. And this is I went to high school in Colorado, and in Colorado there's a large evangelical organization called Focus on the Family, which founded by Jim Dobson. Many people have heard of it. There's a new guy leading it, a guy named Jim Daly, who's a friend of mine. And Jim went to a gay rights group foundation in Colorado and said, hey, you and I, he went to the president, Ted Trimpa, of the group and said, you and I disagree about a lot of things that matter, right? They're dividing us. But we both agree that underage sex trafficking in the state of Colorado is a big deal right now, and it needs to be addressed legislatively. So why don't we go to our constituencies and together lobby the Colorado legislature for legislation about underage sex trafficking? So they spent some time together, formed a friendship. I mean, this doesn't make them best buddies, right? They still disagree about really big matters, but they found this common ground, and they worked together for the sake of neighbor and for the sake of other citizens in Colorado, and passed the legislation. And that, to me, is sort of furthering the common good, right, in a way that's from the ground up, that might be small at first, but I think we're at a place where we've got a lot of work to do, and better to start small than be overwhelmed so as not to start at all.
Okay. 4 people to thank before we formally conclude. First of all, Professor Garnett and his program on Church, State, and Society. Thanks for co-sponsoring today's event. Jen Smith in the back. This is our last event in the semester, and as you all know, she really runs the program. She certainly does all the work for the program, so thank you. Thank you, Jen. My class for sharing their time with the community, and I know I did not
pay our lecturer to start with Rousseau, which was the first reading of the class, or say to read Tocqueville, which you need to do for your last 2 class sessions. And lastly, Professor Inazu, that was a fantastically good lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.